This is the sixth in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. Past programs in this series have dealt with the following questions. What are some characteristics that seem to be common among most, if not all, people? In other words, what are some typical characteristics, mental and emotional, that we generally find among people? The second question I've dealt with in past programs is this. What role do our genes and environment play in determining human nature? And last week, I dealt with the question, given our human nature, what tends to satisfy us? What tends to fulfill us? In other words, given our human nature, what's the good life? Today, I'll provide additional information from famous thinkers in response to the question I raised last week. And time permitting, I will deal with the following question. Can anything significant be done to get human beings to treat each other more decently? And now for today's question, at least the first question. Given our human nature, what tends to fulfill us? A brief review of some of the comments I made last week. I pointed out that Aristotle stimulates our thinking. In one of the most famous books he ever wrote, the lead sentence is the following. Human beings by nature desire to know. Human beings by nature desire to know. Aristotelian scholar Mortimer Adler has said that what Aristotle is saying, in other words, is that the desire for knowledge in us is as much a natural need as the desire for food. Aristotle defined wisdom as knowledge of the highest things. Specifically, what kinds of knowledge constitute wisdom? Well, among the various kinds of knowledge that constitute wisdom is self-knowledge. I've mentioned in many programs in the past the famous Greek maxim, know thyself. And know thyself, in a certain sense, translates into greater self-awareness and greater understanding. Among other things, it involves learning how to deal better with our anxiety, nervousness, loneliness, boredom, lust, greed, feelings of inferiority and inadequacy. Wisdom also involves acquiring knowledge that helps us to better understand reality. Reality being defined as the way things really are. And this also, of course, would involve a clearer, better understanding of human life. I think it's fair to say that we all have illusions about reality, specifically about human life. And we are often frustrated because we try to make life work in a way in which it won't because of our illusions. For example, psychiatrist M. Scott Peck has said that many people have illusions about romantic love and marriage. They have certain myths in their mind concerning marriage and romantic love, and they try to make their lives conform to these myths. They try to make their lives conform to these mistaken ideas, and consequently they become very frustrated as a result of their illusions. But, says Dr. Peck, if they had a better handle on reality, on the way things really are, they wouldn't suffer from these illusions concerning romantic love, marriage, and many other aspects of life. Single people also have their own illusions. Remember, Aristotle said that human beings by nature desire to know. In other words, what Aristotle is saying is that whether people realize it or not, they want wisdom. They want to know the best way to live. Besides greater self-knowledge and greater understanding of reality, in other words, what's true, what's false, what else constitutes wisdom? Well, people need to learn to think critically. They need a questioning attitude. People need to realize that the majority is often wrong. Walt Whitman arguably America's greatest poet, in one of the prefaces to his great work, Leaves of Grass, said this, and I think this is highly illuminating. Again, I'm quoting Walt Whitman. Re-examine all you have been told in school or in church or in any book, and dismiss whatever insults your own soul. Critical thinking today involves, among other things, not being a slave to the values promoted by the advertising industry, the TV industry, and the entertainment industry in general. An important question I think each of us has to ask himself or herself is this: what fulfills us more, passively amusing ourselves or deepening ourselves? Amusing ourselves or learning more about ourselves, other people, or life? Is our human nature such that learning, growing in understanding, make life more worthwhile, more satisfying than simply passively amusing ourselves? The great Renaissance artist Leonardo da Vinci put it this way. Da Vinci said, "Understanding is the noblest of pleasures." And Socrates said this: "The unexamined life is not worth living." I have found that in learning, I can often combine deepening myself with pleasure. I have found that even troubling insights about myself and about life, I've often found those insights to be exciting, and I have found that often those insights can lead to good things. On the subject of lifelong learning, I have found that lifelong learning can alleviate most boredom in life, and also it can has helped me to develop perspective, to determine what's really important in life. So often, all of us have quite limited intellectual vision, and I think it's safe to say that one of our missions in life is to transform our ordinary minds into enlightened minds. On the subject of amusing ourselves, I'm confident that if the great thinkers were alive today, there would be a consensus among them that almost all of television programming and most of the internet and video games could never be as satisfying as attempting to increase our wisdom. When we amuse ourselves, we find that it provides only a very temporary relief from our anxiety, nervousness, boredom, loneliness, etc. In contrast to acquiring wisdom, which can provide much more significant relief from the problems we encounter on a daily basis. There is, of course, a place in life for passively amusing ourselves. I don't doubt at times it may be helpful. Yes, I, at times, do engage in passively amusing myself. But I think it's fair to say that a life dedicated to amusement, a life devoid of efforts at enlightenment, at deepening ourselves, is likely to be a very unsatisfying life. It would involve little, if any, emotional and mental growth. Besides seeking enlightenment, seeking to deepen ourselves by increasing our awareness, what else helps us to fulfill our human nature? Remember, the main question I'm dealing with in this program is, given our human nature, what tends to fulfill us, to satisfy us? Well, so many of the great thinkers have said that in one way or another, developing empathy and compassion and cultivating a desire to alleviate suffering in the world, that these two things can do a great deal to help satisfy our human needs. And when I talk about alleviating suffering in the world, I'm not suggesting, for example, that one has to go to a third world country to alleviate suffering, although I think that can be an excellent idea, and I very much admire people who work, for example, for poverty organizations in the undeveloped world, striving every day to help people who are suffering very much to alleviate their suffering. But I think it's fair to say that in our own environment, right here on Staten Island, we can alleviate suffering. Anne Frank, who wrote the very famous diary, The Diary of Anne Frank, in her diary says this: "We can always give something to someone, even if it's only kindness." Cultivating compassion means acknowledging that suffering is a fact of life. Singer Bob Dylan put it this way. In his autobiography, he says that when he was very young, one of his grandmothers, who herself was suffering from a very serious ailment, gave him this advice. Again, this is Bob Dylan's mother talking. She said this. She said, "Bobby, be kind to everybody you ever meet, because everybody's fighting a very hard battle." Cultivating compassion and a desire to alleviate suffering in the world can help us to become less self-absorbed, less greedy, less angry, less envious. To become more compassionate is to become a more loving person. And perhaps the most famous words ever written about love were written by St. Paul. This is from 1 Corinthians 13. My guess is that some of you are familiar with this passage. Again, it's a very, very famous passage on love. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy others and does not brag about itself. It is not swollen with self. It does not flare with anger. It does not bear a grudge. It delights in truth. It keeps all confidences, all trusts. It endureth all things. 3 things matter in life: hoping, believing, and loving. But supreme is loving. What St. Paul is saying, in other words, is what fulfills us, in his opinion, is working at being more patient, more kind, working at being less egotistical, arrogant, pretentious, prideful, phony, working at not being envious and not being angry, working at being trustworthy. When people confide in us, can we be trusted not to betray their confidences? St. Paul also talks about working at enduring, working at persevering. He says that love endureth all things. Love beareth all things. When things are going badly for us, do we use that as an excuse to be less kind and less loving to others? Is it possible that our human nature is such that caring about others and serving others actually makes us happier? And is it possible that our human nature is such that not giving a damn about others, not caring about justice, just looking out for number one, makes us less happy? Dostoevsky, in his famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov, I think provides some illumination. One of the characters in that book raises the question, what is hell? And here is the answer he gets. Hell is the suffering of being unable to love. I indicated earlier that one of the major obstacles to loving others and hence self-fulfillment is envy. Envy, therefore, deserves more attention. And so many of the great thinkers do address themselves to the subject of envy, since they believe it has the potential for causing much unhappiness in life. Indeed, some of the great thinkers have claimed that envy is the most common emotion. Spinoza, the famous Dutch philosopher, claimed that human beings are naturally envious creatures. He said this. Spinoza said that most human beings are prone to rejoice at other people's failures and to be upset at their successes. Historian Will Durant, in his writings, claimed that so often friends are envious of friends. And here is what he said. Here are his words. Again, historian Will Durant. Only the noblest spirits can bear with equanimity the success of their friends. And writer Mary McCarthy has said that one of the most common traits among middle-class people is envy. Indeed, writer Mary McCarthy goes on to say that the only feeling some middle-class people have for other people is envy. Why she zeroes in on the middle class, I don't know. Arthur Schopenhauer, the famous German philosopher, claimed that as we grow older, one of two characteristics will come to dominate our disposition, either envy or compassion. Philosopher Bertrand Russell, perhaps the most famous philosopher of the 20th century, reminds us that envy hurts, and not only hurts the possible object of our envy, but hurts ourselves. Bertrand Russell claimed, it is impossible to be envious of someone and to be happy at the same time. That envy, by its very nature, causes us discomfort, causes us unhappiness. The Tao Te Ching, very famous Chinese book of wisdom, which I have alluded to in many previous programs, claims that perhaps the best antidote to envy is to see other people as suffering human beings. Again, possibly the best antidote to envy is to see other people as suffering beings. Indeed, both Bertrand Russell and Arthur Schopenhauer, two of the greatest philosophers in history, claimed that we should look upon other people as our fellow sufferers. The idea that no one gets out of this life without doing some significant suffering. The Tao Te Ching, again, the Chinese book of wisdom I referred to before, it says this about the importance of compassion, and I'm quoting the Tao Te Ching. Heaven arms with compassion those whom she would not see destroyed. Again, heaven arms with compassion those whom she would not see destroyed. Again, the Tao Te Ching reminding us that if we don't become compassionate, we may become extremely envious, and in so doing, we will do great damage to ourselves. Other antidotes to envy are the following. Gratitude, having gratitude for what we have and not ingratitude for what we don't have. And also, better intellectual vision. And what do I mean by that? And what do the great thinkers mean by having better intellectual vision when it comes to the subject of envy? Well, what they mean is this. So often, envious people, when they see the world, always compare what they have to what others have and don't appreciate what they have in and of itself. For example, someone may have a very nice automobile, a new automobile, perhaps a car costing $18,000, $20,000, and they're very satisfied with their car until their neighbor buys a luxury sedan, a car perhaps costing $40,000 or $50,000. And now those sane people who are very happy with their $20,000 car are now suffering from great discontent because their neighbor has a $50,000 or $60,000 car. Again, it's their intellectual vision, I think it's fair to say, that's causing the problem. They're not able to see their car in and of itself and the value of their car in and of itself. Again, the question I've been dealing with today is, given our human nature, what tends to fulfill us? What tends to satisfy us? And I think the famous Buddhist writer, Sogyal Rinpoche, provides some important summary remarks. Sogyal Rinpoche has said that really there are only two very important things in life. First, acquiring knowledge that helps us to better understand the human condition. And secondly, learning to love others. Learning to love others. Aristotle put it this way. Aristotle said that just as we naturally desire to acquire knowledge, we naturally desire to love other people and be loved by other people. Actually, spiritual and intellectual development generally go hand in hand. The idea is, the more loving we become, usually the more understanding of others we are. And the more understanding we are of others, generally the more loving we become. The idea is, and many writers have commented on this, that love and understanding tend to be reciprocal. Pretty interesting idea, I think. The great thinkers encourage us to engage in a kind of self-forgetfulness. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl, in his very famous book entitled Man's Search for Meaning, says this, and I think it provides a very good summary to this discussion of what might fulfill us, what might fulfill our human nature. Psychiatrist Viktor Frankl wrote the following words, and I'm quoting him. The more one forgets himself by dedicating himself to a cause or to another person to love, the more human he becomes, and the more he or she fulfills himself or herself, actualizes himself or herself. Since I have a little time remaining, I'd like to provide some book recommendations concerning the 6 programs I've done so far on the subject of human nature. And these books, I think, all tend to provide great illumination on this topic. I highly recommend psychiatrist Alfred Adler's book entitled Understanding Human Nature. Adler, considered to be one of the great psychiatrists of the 20th century. And I just mentioned a book a couple of minutes ago, which also I think is a great book and provides some great insights. Again, written by another psychiatrist, Viktor Frankl, and the name of the book is Man's Search for Meaning. Viktor Frankl, by the way, was one of the more interesting 20th century psychiatrists for a variety of reasons, one of which is that as a young man in his late 20s, early 30s, he was an inmate in a Nazi concentration camp and indeed lost his wife and his parents in the Holocaust. So Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist who firsthand experienced incredible suffering in his own life and went on to live to be a very old man and made some very valuable contributions to psychiatry. And I suspect that his experiences of enduring the kind of suffering he experienced perhaps made him a better psychiatrist. Another book I highly recommend, a book that I've recommended in past programs. It's a book by Sigmund Freud entitled Civilization and Its Discontents. It provides a very good overview of Freud's philosophy and psychology. So if you've never read any book by Sigmund Freud, and Freud wrote many books, I suspect he wrote more than 10 books as I recall, I think the book you should start with is Civilization and Its Discontents. It's a very short book. By the way, all of the books I've recommended so far today are in paperback as well as in hardback. And another book I highly recommend, again on this subject of human nature, is a book by biologist E.O. Wilson. You recall a couple of weeks ago I dealt with the question, which matters more in determining human nature, our genes or our environment, and I devoted a whole program to that. And biologist E.O. Wilson is one of the more famous people who has participated in this debate concerning nurture versus nature, genes versus environment, and how they affect the development of human nature. Also, I suggest that if you want to find out more about human nature, you read any good history book. Any good history book. Why so? Well, Tolstoy said, "The aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves." The aim of history is to teach humanity and nations to know themselves. So any good history book, in one way or another, is helping us to better understand human nature. Before I close, I want to remind the viewers that this program has a website, and you might want to access the website. It's lifeloveandphilosophy.com. And by the way, on the website, you'll find a short list of recommended books that I feel might be helpful to you. My guess is that some of you have already read some of the books. And these are books which, in a general way, deal with the approximately 80 programs. I can't believe that. Yes, 80 programs that I've done on CTV. And finally, I wish to remind all of us that Henry David Thoreau claimed that we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, Thoreau penned the following words: "To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts."